Well, again, back to traveling. So when I'm 19, I worked on a vineyard in Champagne in France, and I did the vendage, the grape picking, and I saw what that entailed. But I also felt what it entailed because it's really hard work. It's an incredibly physically difficult job to bend over and snip grapes all day. And there was something magical about that. There was something magical about this family who grew these grapes, who made their own wine, but put a lot of it into a co op because that's a lot of the way they do it in France. And the joy they took in growing these vines and reaping this harvest and sharing their wine and their food with their workers around the family table. There was something so beautiful about that experience. And so it nestled in there somewhere, Jake. It just nestled in there. And then my mother had always told us when we were children that our family had come to Tasmania when, a long, long time ago, a young woman called Caroline had been our first ancestor to arrive in colonial Tasmania. And she had arrived as a young widow because apparently her husband had fallen over Niagara Falls on their honeymoon. And even as a little 6-year-old and a future writer, I remember thinking, that's a bit suspicious. I remember being very curious about this idea of a husband going over Niagara Falls. Like, had he slipped? Had he been pushed? What had happened? And then the other part of that story was that Caroline was the daughter of a man who was destined to be a duke. His parents had been beheaded in the French Revolution, and he had escaped to Scotland, come down to London, and then, for whatever reason, his daughter Caroline, the one with the husband going over Niagara Falls, had arrived in early Tasmania. And that was the story we were told as children. And I remember saying to Mum, where's Scotland? Thinking, it was somewhere close by. And she said to me, oh, it's on the other side of the world. And we had one of those globes. Did you have one of those as a child? We had a world globe. And so she spun it around and showed me for the first time where we were and where Scotland was. And I remember thinking, I've got to go there. I've got to go there. And so I held that in my heart for a very long time, hence the passion for, I think I have to leave. I think I don't really want to pursue acting. I really want to be a writer. I will go to Scotland. And so I went overland. I went across Australia and up through Asia, and then from Hong Kong across to London. And then I did all of Europe and eventually got to Scotland. In my own character, it's in there. And then I went to dinner one night about 2008 for a girlfriend's birthday, and she sat me next to a really wonderful and very famous winemaker called Andrew Peary. His label now is Apogee, and he is a spectacular maker of sparkling wine. And Andrew that night told me a story that in the early 1820s, in colonial Van Diemen's Land, there'd been a spectacular vineyard that had made a sparkling wine that, in the sort of the myth of Tasmanian winemaking, this wine had been so good it had gone all the way to Paris, where it won an award at a Paris wine show. And I remember looking at Andrew saying, don't tell anyone else that story. I want to write that story. And then and so that's quite a long time ago now. And I had a number of other books in process, so it took me a while to get through all the rest of them. And finally I was ready. But in the meantime, my sister had done some research on the Caroline who'd first arrived in colonial Tasmania. And she found out that there was a much darker story. His parents may or may not have been beheaded in the French Revolution. We haven't sorted that one out yet. But he had been an emigre with his sister, and they had first gone to Scotland, and then they'd settled in London, and then he'd murdered a woman on the Battersea Bridge. Well, one of the wonderful things about working with a blend of fact and fiction is you can slide time and you can slide dates. You don't have to be constrained. I remember saying to my publisher at the time, it doesn't quite work. My family history doesn't quite fit into the vineyard history. And she said, Heather, it's fiction. You can make it up. And I was like, oh wow, what amazing freedom. But I felt a great sense of responsibility to the historical record because I've drawn from history so many times and I have a passion for history. The one of the most fun characters in this was drawn from a tiny newspaper extract in the main London paper of the Times. I don't think it was the Times, but it's a version of the Times. And it talked about a thief and indeed the sister of Caroline's aunt, who really was who really was my ancestor. And it said when she was caught for thieving, that there was so much in the warehouse that she kept that it was enough to furnish a bazaar. And I thought, now there's a very successful thief, but that's all I had to go on. And so there's a character in the book, as you all know, called Tante Henriette, because she's still very French. And she is a very, very successful thief. And so that was one of the fun things to find. But then when Caroline arrives in colonial Van Diemen's Land, it wasn't called Tasmania until 1856, when they changed the name to expunge the terrible record of vicious criminals that had resided there. And let me say, I say that with great irony because many of them had merely stolen a duck or something and were given 14 years for it. The feeling of walking those streets, because I know those streets very well and what streets were actually there, what buildings were there, and a lot of that is still intact in Hobart. There are a lot of cottages. I had a friend who lived in a cottage that was a sandstone cottage from 1820. A lot of it's still there. So my life has been imbued by that history in the day-to-day of my childhood and growing up in Tasmania. But to look through the lens of the colonial record, of what people were writing about, of the mud in the streets and the wagons and the smell and the convicts chained in gangs working the roads, building the buildings, there were so many vivid ways to look out the window and see it through the eyes of 1820, 1830, 1840. The scale of nature was really extraordinary there. There was Tasmania, the Hobart, which is the capital city of Tasmania, is at the south of Tasmania. It's actually on an extraordinary harbour. It's a massive river and a massive harbour with a mountain to one side, to the west of it, that is really the foothills of the bay that makes up the harbour. It's very, very protected, and it was a breeding ground for whales. So hundreds and thousands of whales over the years came through there to birth their babies. And they said that when in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when whalers first started going to Hobart, they discovered it because they were in New Zealand at the Bay of Islands, which was also a big whale processing area, a very big whaling centre there. And they would travel across the Tasman Sea and up the Derwent River. And they said that you could walk on the backs of the whales all the way across the river. And it's at least 5 kilometres across the river. So it's quite horrifying, quite horrifying to see that scale of nature. But there's also a record of a woman who was a British citizen, and she came out to Tasmania because her husband was a landowner. There was a big push for people to sort of do the land grab and build their wealth that way. So there were a lot of those people arriving too, entrepreneurs. And she talks about sailing up the Derwent River on a brigantine, and it took 4 hours for a flock of migratory birds to pass over and for the sun to finally be revealed again. And that, seeing it, how rich it was as a landscape of incredible fertility, huge trees, massive scale of nature that we just don't have anymore. And the world is denuded of insects and birds, and we don't even see it because we grew up in the time we grew up. But looking back at it through that, I did extensive reading for this book, a massive amount of reading to try and put myself into the psyche of the time as much as anything and to understand what people knew at that time, not to try and revisit my or visit my 21st century sensibilities onto it in any way, but to find out what was the intellectual landscape of the early 1800s, which took me back to the 1700s and, colonialism and the Industrial Revolution and the birth of mathematics and in terms of Galileo and our sense of the cosmos. There were so many aspects to it that an educated young woman like Caroline is, because her father has trained her to be an apothecary. He was a chemist and apothecary too, and he really was in real life. The that was very deep work. And then, of course, the job is to try and forget it all and just be with those people. So we're mixing with entrepreneurs, very wily entrepreneurs, including a very famous man called Captain Swanston, who is not remembered in the Tasmanian record at all, even though he was such an extraordinary entrepreneur and had a significant part to play in the settlement of Melbourne. And the main street of Melbourne is named after him. But in Tasmania, he has been expunged for very good reason, as we find out in the book.